On June 17, 1943, 19-year-old Katherine Marino walked out of a Georgia farmhouse wearing a pale yellow dress and carrying nothing but a small cloth purse. She told her employer she was going to town for something urgent. She never came back. For 40 years, her family searched for answers while the truth lay buried beneath the very barn where she had worked every day. What they didn't know was that the respected farmer who helped organize search parties, who comforted Katherine's grieving mother, and who lived as a pillar of the community, was the same man who had murdered Katherine and buried her body in his own backyard. This case proves that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we trust the most. If you're ready to discover how a construction crew accidentally exposed a 4-decade-old murder, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This story will show you that the earth never forgets, and neither does justice. Whitfield County, Georgia in 1943 was a place where everyone knew everyone, where families had worked the same red clay soil for generations, and where a young woman could disappear without a trace simply by walking down a country road. The Hamilton farm sat 3 miles outside Dalton, a prosperous 100-acre spread of cotton fields and cattle pastures that represented everything stable and respectable about rural Georgia during World War II. Katherine Marino had been working for the Hamilton family for 8 months, living in a small room off the back porch and caring for 6-year-old Thomas and 4-year-old Elizabeth, while their mother Eleanor managed the household and their father Robert oversaw the farming operation. At 19, Katherine was everything a farm family could want in domestic help: quiet, reliable, gentle with children, and grateful for steady work that paid $3 a week she could send home to her struggling family in Dalton. Katherine came from Milltown poverty, the daughter of parents who fought daily battles against hunger and eviction. Her father worked irregular shifts at the Crown Cotton Mill when his damaged lungs allowed it, and her mother took in laundry from wealthier families to supplement their meager income. Katherine's weekly wages made the difference between survival and catastrophe for the Marino family, which made her reliability all the more important to everyone involved. Those who knew Katherine described her as a gentle soul with a voice like honey when she sang old hymns while hanging laundry or preparing meals. She attended church every Sunday, wrote letters home every Sunday night, and walked them to the Crossroads mailbox every Monday morning before dawn. She was the kind of young woman who represented the best of small-town values: hardworking, devout, and devoted to family above all else. But on that humid Thursday morning in June, something was different. Eleanor Hamilton would later tell investigators that Katherine seemed distracted during breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as she poured milk for the children. Around mid-morning, Katherine approached Eleanor in the front parlor, where the older woman sat mending clothes while listening to war news on the radio. Katherine said she needed to go into town, that there was something urgent she had to attend to, something personal that couldn't wait. Eleanor, preoccupied with her own worries about rationing and her brother fighting somewhere in the Pacific, waved her off without asking questions. She told Katherine to be back by supper time to help with the children's baths, never imagining that this casual dismissal would be the last time she saw the girl alive. Katherine walked out the front door wearing her pale yellow church dress with buttons up the front, carrying nothing but a small cloth purse that contained perhaps a few coins and a handkerchief. She didn't take her other clothes from the back room, didn't take the Bible her mother had given her, didn't take the photograph she kept under her pillow of her family standing outside their tiny house in Dalton. She simply walked down the long dirt driveway lined with oak trees heavy with Spanish moss and turned left onto the county road that led back toward town. Old Mr. Fitzgerald, who lived half a mile down the road, saw her walking in the late morning heat. He tipped his hat from his front porch, and Katherine smiled but didn't stop to chat as she sometimes did. That brief exchange would later be identified as the last confirmed sighting of Katherine Marino, though neither she nor the elderly farmer could have known they were participating in the final scene of her life. When Katherine didn't return by supper time, Eleanor felt irritation rather than worry. The children were fussy, Robert came in from the fields covered in dust and expecting his dinner hot and ready, and Eleanor had to manage everything herself while Katherine was off attending to whatever personal business had seemed so urgent that morning. Irritation transformed into concern as darkness fell, and by midnight, when Katherine still hadn't returned, Eleanor was shaking Robert awake, insisting that something was wrong. Robert, exhausted from a long day in the fields, muttered that the girl had probably gone to visit family and lost track of time. But Eleanor's face was pale in the lamplight, her voice insistent as she repeated that Katherine wasn't that kind of girl, that she wouldn't just disappear without word, that something terrible must have happened. The next morning, Robert drove their old Ford pickup into Dalton to check on Katherine. He found the Marino family's small shotgun house on the south side of town, where Katherine's mother stood in the doorway, and went white when Robert asked if Katherine was there. No, she hadn't seen her daughter since Sunday after church. Katherine always came on Sundays, always brought her weekly wages home to help with expenses, always stayed for dinner and helped with the younger children. The panic that had been a seed in Eleanor's chest now bloomed fully in Mrs. Marino's eyes. Together, they went to the Dalton Police Department, where a single deputy named Harris sat behind a metal desk sorting through paperwork about ration card violations. Deputy Harris took down the information with visible disinterest, suggesting that the girl had probably run off with a boyfriend, that it happened all the time during the war when young women got ideas about adventure and excitement. Mrs. Marino's voice broke as she insisted Katherine wasn't like that her daughter was responsible and devoted to family, that she would never abandon her job or her obligations. But Harris just shrugged and promised to keep an eye out, his tone suggesting he'd already mentally filed the case under teenage runaway, and moved on to more pressing matters. By afternoon, Sheriff Thomas McLeod had been notified of Katherine's disappearance. At 61 years old, McLeod was a man who had spent his entire career managing the kind of rural crime that rarely made headlines: property disputes, cattle theft, and occasional drunk drivers who wrapped their cars around telegraph poles. Missing persons cases in Whitfield County typically resolved themselves within 48 hours when the wayward teenager or confused elderly person turned up embarrassed and apologetic. McLeod approached Katherine's case with the same assumptions that had served him well for 3 decades, never imagining that this particular disappearance would haunt him until the day he died. He organized search parties from among the local men who were too old or physically unfit for military service, and by evening they were walking the roads and ditches between the Hamilton farm and Dalton, calling Katherine's name into the thick Georgia air. The June heat was merciless, with temperatures climbing into the mid-90s and humidity so thick that breathing felt like drowning. The volunteers searched methodically, checking abandoned sheds, peering into creek beds, and walking the old logging roads that snaked through the county's dense pine forests. They found the usual rural debris: rusted car parts, discarded bottles, a child's shoe half buried in mud, but no trace of the girl in the yellow dress who had walked away from the Hamilton farm and vanished. The search continued for 3 more days, expanding to include every road, path, and trail within a 10-mile radius of Katherine's last known location. Church volunteers joined the effort, organizing food and water for the search teams while praying for Katherine's safe return. The community rallied around the Marino family with the kind of support that small towns provide in times of crisis, but their efforts yielded nothing but exhaustion and growing despair. On June 22, Sheriff McLeod drove out to the Hamilton farm to conduct what he called a formal interview with Katherine's employers. Robert Hamilton met him on the front porch, wiping his hands on a rag and expressing visible annoyance at the interruption to his workday. Eleanor stood in the doorway behind him, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable as McLeod asked them to walk through Katherine's final day. Robert's answers were clipped and impatient. The girl had seemed fine, maybe a little nervous, but nothing out of the ordinary. She'd asked to go to town, Eleanor had given permission, and that was the end of it. Had Katherine been courting anyone? Not that they knew of. She kept to herself, did her work, went to church on Sundays. Quiet girl, good worker, no problems. McLeod asked to examine Katherine's room, noting the neatly made bed, the dresses still hanging on wooden pegs, the Bible and family photographs sitting undisturbed on a small table. He opened drawers and looked under the mattress, finding nothing that suggested planned flight or evidence of foul play. Just the ordinary possessions of an ordinary girl, who had apparently walked away from her life without taking anything that mattered to her. The sheriff requested permission to search the property's outbuildings, and Robert agreed with obvious irritation, following McLeod as if to ensure he didn't waste too much time or disturb too much work. They checked the hay barn, the equipment shed, and the old root cellar that smelled of damp earth and stored potatoes. McLeod even walked out to the far pasture where cattle grazed in whatever shade they could find. Scanning the tree line for any sign of disturbance, the problem was evidence or the complete absence of it. In 1943, forensic science in rural Georgia meant little more than eyewitness testimony and physical objects that could be held in hand. There were no fingerprint databases to search, no blood tests that could detect minute traces, no way to track someone's movements beyond who had seen them and when. Katherine had walked down a road and disappeared, and without a body or witness to something criminal, there was simply nothing for McLeod to investigate. He returned to his office and filed a missing person report, sending descriptions to neighboring counties and contacting the state police in Atlanta. The officials he spoke with promised to keep watch, but made it clear they had bigger concerns with wartime security and rationing violations. Missing farm girls weren't exactly a priority when the entire country was focused on defeating fascism overseas. Marino came to the sheriff's office every week through July and into August, her face growing thinner and her eyes hollowing with sleepless nights. She brought photographs of Katherine, pressed them into McLeod's hands, and begged him to do more. He had no answers for her beyond promises that the investigation remained active, though privately he was beginning to believe what Deputy Harris had suggested from the beginning. Katherine had probably run off. Maybe she was pregnant and ashamed. Maybe she'd met some soldier passing through town and gotten swept up in wartime romance. Maybe she'd simply wanted escape from the suffocating smallness of Dalton, and had taken her chance when it appeared. Young women were doing that kind of thing more often since the war began, breaking free from traditional constraints and seeking adventure in cities where defense plants offered good wages and independence. By September, the case was effectively closed, though McLeod never spoke those words aloud to Mrs. Marino. He simply stopped returning her calls, and avoided the south side of town where he might encounter her. The file went into a cabinet alongside other unsolved cases, and the Hamilton family resumed their normal routines. Robert expanded his cattle operation that fall, purchasing 30 head from a neighbor who had lost 2 sons at Anzio and couldn't manage the work anymore. Eleanor threw herself into Red Cross volunteering, rolling bandages and organizing scrap metal drives for the war effort. The children, Thomas and Elizabeth, grew up with only vague memories of the quiet girl who had once made their breakfast and sung them to sleep with old hymns. Katherine Marino became a story, then a rumor, then a ghost that people in Dalton mentioned sometimes when conversations turned to the strange and unexplained. But Katherine hadn't run anywhere. 3 miles from where Sheriff McLeod sat filing papers and closing cases, her body lay in the red Georgia clay, buried beneath the floor of the Hamilton barn, wrapped in burlap and covered with lime. Hidden in darkness while the world above continued turning, oblivious and unmoved by the secret that would remain buried for 4 decades. The years moved forward with the indifference that time shows to human suffering. Katherine Marino's name appeared less and less in conversation, reduced from tragedy to footnote, from mystery to cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters about trusting strangers or walking alone. By 1945, the war had ended and Whitfield County welcomed home its surviving sons while mourning those who hadn't returned. The Crown Cotton Mill roared back to full production, and the business of living consumed the attention that had briefly been spared for a missing girl. Robert Hamilton prospered during the post-war boom. The farm expanded steadily through the late 40s and into the 50s, swallowing up adjacent properties as older farmers died or their children moved to Atlanta seeking factory work and city wages. By 1950, Hamilton owned 200 acres, ran 100 head of cattle, and employed 3 seasonal workers during harvest time. He was elected to the County Board of Supervisors in 1952, a position that elevated his standing in the community and made people address him as Mr. Hamilton with newfound respect. Eleanor aged beside him, her dark hair going silver and her face settling into the resigned expression of women who had learned not to expect joy but had made peace with its absence. She raised Thomas and Elizabeth with firm Methodist discipline, sent them to regional schools, and watched Thomas head off to the University of Georgia in 1955 while Elizabeth married a banker's son from Chattanooga in 1958. She volunteered at the library, organized church socials, and maintained a garden that neighbors admired for its neat rows of tomatoes and squash. If Eleanor ever thought about the girl who had disappeared from her home all those years ago, she never spoke of it. The subject had become as buried as the past itself, something not discussed or examined. The Hamilton children grew up with no memory of Katherine Marino, no knowledge that their childhood home had once been the site of desperate searches, that their father had been questioned by police, that a girl barely older than they were now had vanished after walking out their front door. In Dalton, Mrs. Marino never stopped looking. She kept Katherine's room exactly as it had been, the bed made and the few dresses hanging in the closet, growing moth-eaten and faded with passing decades. Every year on June 17th, the anniversary of the disappearance, she walked to the sheriff's office and asked if there was any news. The sheriffs changed over the years. McLeod retired in 1951 and died of a heart attack in 1954, but each new man treated her with patience and pity, promising they hadn't forgotten while knowing that of course they had. Mr. Marino died in 1961, his lungs finally giving out after decades of cotton dust and cigarette smoke. Mrs. Marino followed him in 1968 at the age of 73, her heart failing in her sleep. Katherine's younger brother Vincent, who had been only 12 when his sister vanished, inherited the house and sold it within a month. He couldn't bear to be in those rooms where his mother had waited every day for a daughter who would never come home. Vincent moved to Florida, changed his name to Vincent Morris, and tried to build a life that didn't carry the weight of unanswered questions. He married, had children, and told them nothing about the sister he'd lost. The grief was too large, too unwieldy. Better to pretend it had never happened than to pass that pain to another generation. Robert Hamilton turned 70 in 1973, looking like what he was, a successful man shaped by hard work and good fortune. His back had bent slightly from decades of physical labor, but his mind remained sharp and his reputation unblemished. He attended church every Sunday, sat in the same pew he'd occupied for 50 years, sang hymns in his rough baritone, and shook hands with the pastor on his way out. He ate dinner with Eleanor at 6 every evening, watched the news, read the paper, and went to bed by 9. By all accounts, he was a pillar of the community, respected, trusted, a man whose word meant something. But at night, sometimes, he woke in darkness with his heart hammering and sweat soaking his undershirt. He would lie there listening to Eleanor's soft breathing beside him, staring at the ceiling, seeing Katherine's face as it had looked in those final moments, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror, her mouth open in a scream that never came because he had struck too fast, too hard. He had told himself for 30 years that he'd had no choice, that Katherine had forced his hand with her threats and demands. She had been pregnant, had threatened to tell Eleanor everything, had threatened to destroy his marriage and his standing in the community. He had convinced himself that he was the victim of circumstance, that any man would have done the same to protect his family and his reputation. The lie had calcified into something like truth through sheer repetition. When morning came and sunlight filled the bedroom, Robert would rise and dress and go about his day, as if the nightmares were nothing more than the random misfirings of an aging brain, meaningless and best ignored. The barn still stood, sturdy and unchanged, its red paint fading to rust but its foundation solid. Robert had modernized other buildings on the property, but left the barn alone, some instinct warning him that disturbing it would disturb other things best left buried. The cattle sheltered there in winter, hay was stacked in the loft each autumn, and life continued above the shallow grave where Katherine lay wrapped in rot and darkness, waiting. Eleanor died in the winter of 1982, pneumonia claiming her in 3 short days. Robert, now 80 years old, lived alone with a part-time nurse who came mornings to ensure he took his medications and ate something resembling breakfast. Thomas visited once a month from Atlanta, his own children now grown and gone. Elizabeth called every Sunday from Chattanooga but rarely made the drive, her excuses always valid and her guilt always evident in her voice. The barn had become a problem. The roof leaked in a dozen places, and the foundation on the south side had begun to sink, pulling the entire structure slightly askew. Thomas, ever practical, hired a construction crew out of Dalton to assess whether the building could be saved or needed to be demolished entirely. The crew arrived on June 8, 1983, 40 years and 3 weeks after Katherine Marino had walked out of the Hamilton farmhouse for the last time. 3 men in their 30s, wearing tool belts and work boots, carrying clipboards and measuring tapes. The foreman, a man named Jack Sullivan, walked the perimeter making notes while his crew examined the foundation and tested the support beams for rot. Sullivan crouched near the southeast corner where the settling was worst, pulling away loose boards to expose the stone and concrete underneath. The foundation was original, likely poured in the 1920s, and age had not been kind. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it into the gap between the dirt floor and the raised foundation, looking for evidence of water damage or termites. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. Bone, unmistakably bone, yellowed and partially exposed where the shifting earth had pulled away from it. The discovery that would finally bring justice for Katherine Marino came not from brilliant detective work or advanced forensic science, but from a construction foreman's flashlight beam piercing 40 years of darkness. Jack Sullivan stood up slowly from his crouch near the barn's southeast corner, his legs suddenly unsteady, and called to his crew to stop working immediately. By noon on June 8, 1983, the Whitfield County Sheriff's Department had cordoned off the Hamilton barn with yellow tape that fluttered in the hot breeze like warning flags. Sheriff Marco O'Brien, 45 years old and in his second term, stood in the barn's dim interior watching as 2 deputies carefully excavated the area Sullivan had identified. They worked with trowels and brushes, techniques learned from a forensic anthropology consultant the department had brought in from the University of Georgia. The consultant, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, was a woman in her 50s with steel, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, who knelt in the dirt directing the excavation with quiet authority. What emerged over the next 6 hours was a skeleton mostly complete, lying in a shallow depression that had once been a deliberately dug grave. The bones were stained dark from decades in the soil, but their arrangement told a story. The body had been placed on its side in a fetal position, wrapped in something that had long since decomposed, likely fabric or burlap. Dr. Walsh photographed everything before allowing the remains to be moved, her camera clicking steadily as she documented the angle of the skull, the position of the arms, the way the leg bones had been tucked up toward the chest. Word spread through Dalton with the speed of wildfire. By evening, news vans from Atlanta had arrived, their satellite dishes raised like strange flowers in the Hamilton front yard. Reporters clutched microphones and shouted questions that no one answered. Sheriff O'Brien held a brief press conference on the front porch, his face grim and his words carefully chosen. Human remains had been discovered during routine building inspection. The medical examiner would determine age, sex, and identity. The investigation was ongoing. No further comment at this time. Robert Hamilton sat in his living room watching the spectacle through lace curtains, his nurse hovering nearby with worried glances. Thomas had driven up from Atlanta within 2 hours of the phone call, bursting through the door with panic in his eyes, demanding to know what was happening. Robert looked at his son, this man he had raised and protected and lied to for 40 years, and said nothing. What was there to say? The earth had finally given up its secret. Old-timers in Dalton, those whose memories stretched back far enough, began to whisper the name Katherine Marino. The timeline fit, the location fit. The girl who had walked away from this very farm in 1943 and never been seen again. At the Dalton Gazette's archive, a young reporter named Michelle Torres found the original missing person report, yellowed and brittle, filed between stories about war bond drives and ration card regulations. She photocopied it and ran it on the front page, beside the story of the discovered remains, and suddenly the case that had been buried for 40 years was alive again. Dr. Walsh transported the remains to the state crime lab in Atlanta, where forensic pathologists would conduct detailed analysis. The bones would tell their story in time, reveal their secrets under fluorescent lights and microscopes. The skull showed signs of trauma, a depressed fracture above the right temple, consistent with a blow from a heavy object. The pelvis was clearly female, and the estimated age based on bone development was late teens to early 20s. But there was something else, something that transformed the case from tragedy into something even darker. Nestled among the pelvic bones were smaller fragments, delicate and heartbreaking. Fetal remains, unmistakable even after 4 decades in the ground. Whoever this woman was, she had been pregnant when she died. She had carried life within her, and someone had extinguished both with violence and buried the evidence beneath a barn floor, believing the earth would keep the secret forever. The forensic report was clinical and precise, but anyone who read it could feel the human story beneath the medical terminology. Female, age approximately 19 to 22 years. Died of blunt force cranial trauma. Pregnant at time of death, 2nd trimester. Buried in shallow grave wrapped in fabric. Presence of lime suggested deliberate attempt to accelerate decomposition. No personal effects recovered with remains. The bones had been stripped of everything that might have named them, left anonymous in the darkness. But the timeline, the location, and the physical characteristics all pointed to one conclusion: these were the remains of Katherine Marino, the farm girl who had walked out of the Hamilton house wearing a yellow dress and carrying a small cloth purse on June 17, 1943. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was called in to handle what had become a murder case. Detective Lieutenant Frank County, 53 years old and graying, arrived with Detective Sarah Quinn, 31 and sharp-eyed. They set up operations in a conference room at the sheriff's department, covering the walls with photographs of the excavation site, the skeletal remains and maps of the Hamilton property. They pulled the original case file from 1943, thin but providing the foundation they needed. Physical description matched: female, 5'3", slender build, 19 years old. Last seen leaving the Hamilton farm, never heard from again. The pieces fit together with grim precision. On June 22, exactly 40 years after Sheriff McLeod had first interviewed the Hamilton family, Detectives County and Quinn returned to the property. Robert Hamilton answered the door himself, leaning heavily on a cane, his face deeply lined and his eyes milky with cataracts. He invited them in with old-fashioned courtesy, offered them iced tea that they declined. They sat in the living room where photographs of grandchildren crowded the mantel, and Detective County led the questioning. His voice was gentle but persistent as he asked Robert to describe what he remembered about Katherine's disappearance, acknowledging it had been 40 years but hoping something might come back. Robert's answers were slow and thoughtful, painted with the fog of age. He remembered the girl, of course. She had worked for them, cared for the children. Good worker, quiet. She had left one day to go to town and never returned. Terrible thing. He and his wife had been devastated, had helped with the search, had talked to the sheriff multiple times back then. Detective Quinn took notes, watching Robert's face for tells, for the micro-expressions that might indicate deception. But what she saw was an old man, frail and seemingly sincere, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his cane. It was difficult to imagine this person capable of murder, but she had learned in her years on the job that murderers rarely looked like monsters. They looked like everyone else. They looked like grandfathers sitting in clean living rooms, offering iced tea to investigators. But something felt off. The old man seemed too calm, too composed for someone whose property had just yielded a murder victim. Then came the breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. Not advanced forensics or dramatic interrogation, but something far more mundane. Old medical records gathering dust in the basement of Dalton Memorial Hospital. Detective Quinn had requested all patient files from 1943, and the hospital administrator found what they were looking for. Katherine Marino had visited Dr. Edward Boyle on May 14, 1943, complaining of nausea, fatigue, and missed menstrual periods. The doctor's notes were clinical, but clear. Patient appears approximately 12 weeks pregnant. Patient became emotional when diagnosis confirmed. Declined to name father, appeared distressed. Katherine had been pregnant, and she had known it 5 weeks before she disappeared. This changed everything. They now had motive. A young woman pregnant and unmarried in 1943 would have faced devastating social consequences. But more than that, whoever had fathered the child would have faced consequences too, especially if he was already married, especially if he was her employer. The investigation accelerated. They needed evidence connecting Robert Hamilton to Katherine beyond their employer-employee relationship. In the Hamilton property search, they found a single photograph tucked between pages of a farm ledger from 1943. It showed Robert and Katherine standing together beside a fence, her hand resting on his arm. The intimacy of the pose was unmistakable. This wasn't employer and employee, this was something else entirely. On July 3, 1983, they brought Robert Hamilton in for formal questioning. Faced with the medical records, the photograph, and 40 years of accumulated evidence, the weight of his secret finally became too much to bear. Robert Hamilton, 80 years old and exhausted by decades of lies, looked across the interrogation room table and said he wanted to tell the truth. The confession came slowly, delivered in a voice that wavered between defiance and exhaustion. The affair had begun in 1942. Katherine had become pregnant. She had threatened to tell Eleanor everything unless Robert left his wife and married her. On June 17, 1943, she had demanded he meet her in the barn for one final conversation. When he refused her ultimatum, she had started toward the house to tell Eleanor herself. Robert had picked up a shovel and struck her once in the head. She had died instantly. He had buried her in the barn, covered the grave with lime and dirt, and lived with the secret for 40 years. He had joined the search parties, had comforted Katherine's mother, had built a respected life on top of a murdered girl's grave. Robert Hamilton was arrested and charged with murder. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He died 16 months later in his cell, his heart finally giving out under the weight of truth. Katherine Marino was buried properly in Dalton City Cemetery beside her parents, 40 years after she had walked out of the Hamilton farmhouse and into eternity. Her brother Vincent came from Florida to lay her to rest, to finally give his sister the dignity she had been denied in death. The Hamilton farm was sold and developed into a subdivision where families now live, unaware of the history beneath their foundations. Only the old oak trees remain, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, silent witnesses to everything that was lost and everything that was finally found.